Card declined again, the cashier said, louder this time, like the words needed an audience, and the soft hum of espresso machines didn't quite hide the shift in the room. A few heads turned, a chair scraped, someone exhaled a quiet laugh, and the woman standing at the counter froze, her fingers tightening around the worn leather strap of her purse, as if holding on to something more than just a bag. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady but thin. It should have gone through, but the cashier only shrugged, already impatient, already moving on. "Ma'am, there's a line." And there was, stretching back nearly 15 feet toward the glass door, people checking watches, tapping phones, measuring her worth in seconds. Behind her stood Ethan Brooks, work boots dusted with dry cement, sleeves rolled just below his elbows, the faint scent of motor oil clinging to him like a second skin, and he watched, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with something quieter, something older. "You can step aside if you can't pay," the cashier added, sharper now, and that was the moment the room leaned in. The invisible line between dignity and embarrassment drawn in the space of a breath. Ethan stepped forward. "Hey," he said, simple, calm, like it didn't cost him anything at all. "Just put it on mine." The cashier blinked. The woman turned, surprised. "No, I can," she began. But Ethan was already placing a few crumpled bills on the counter. Exact change. No hesitation, no performance. "It's just coffee," he added, not looking at her long enough to make it a moment, just long enough to make it human. 3 quick movements. The register beeped, the receipt printed, the cup slid across the counter. 2 seconds of silence followed, heavier than the noise before it, like something unseen had shifted in the air. The woman took the cup slowly, her eyes searching his face, maybe for a reason, maybe for a name. But Ethan had already stepped aside, already moved forward in line, already returned to being just another man no one noticed. Outside, the late morning light spilled across the sidewalk, soft and indifferent, and Ethan pushed the door open with his shoulder, the bell above it chiming once, faint and forgettable. The world kept moving, cars passing, people walking, nothing stopping to mark what had just happened, and yet something lingered, something quiet and stubborn, like the echo of a note no one had meant to hear. Because what no one in that coffee shop understood, not the cashier, not the people in line, not even the woman holding the cup, was that moments like that don't disappear. They wait, they breathe, they remember, and sometimes they come back with a weight that no one in the room is ready for. The bell above the cafe door had barely finished echoing when she stepped outside, the paper cup still warm in her hands, but her eyes were no longer on the coffee. They were on him. Ethan walked ahead without urgency, crossing the cracked sidewalk toward an old pickup truck parked along the curb, its paint faded, its edges worn by years of quiet use. And he moved like a man who had learned not to expect the world to notice him. "Wait," she called, not loud, but clear enough to reach him before. He opened the door, and he paused, just slightly, turning halfway as if unsure whether the moment belonged to him. "You did not have to do that," she said, stepping closer, her voice steadier now, her posture no longer small but composed. And yet there was something searching in her eyes, something that had not been there inside. Ethan gave a small shrug, the kind that carried no weight of sacrifice. "It is just coffee," he replied, simple, direct, like kindness should never be complicated, and, for a second, the noise of the street softened around them, cars passing slower, footsteps quieter, like the world was giving them space without knowing why. "Still," she said, her gaze fixed on him. "People do not usually step in like that." And there it was, not gratitude alone, but curiosity, as if she was trying to understand a language she had not heard in a long time. Ethan glanced at the cup in her hands, then back at her. "Maybe they should," he said, and the words landed gently. Without judgment, without pride, just truth. A short silence followed, not awkward, not empty, just present. And then he reached for his truck door again, ready to let the moment in the way most moments do, quietly and without consequence. But she did not move, not yet. "At least let me pay you back," she offered, already reaching into her purse again. But this time slower, more deliberate, as if she knew the answer before she finished the sentence. Ethan shook his head before she could even open it. "No need," he said. Just pass it on to someone else someday. And that was it. No name, no exchange, no expectation, just a line drawn in quiet dignity that he did not cross. She studied him then, really studied him, the worn boots, the calloused hands, the calm in his eyes that did not ask for anything, and something in her expression shifted. Again, deeper this time, like a realization she was not ready to say out loud. You are different, she said softly, almost to herself, and Ethan let out a faint breath that could have been a laugh if it tried harder. No, he answered, opening the truck door. I just mind my business. But even as he said it, the moment disagreed. He climbed into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a low, familiar rumble. And for a second longer than necessary, she stood there watching him, the cup still in her hands, the steam rising into the cool air like something fleeting, something fragile. Then he pulled away, merging into the slow flow of traffic, gone as quietly as he had appeared, leaving behind no trace except the feeling that something small had just happened that was not small at all. And as she stood there on the sidewalk, surrounded by a city that never stopped moving, she realized something unsettling, something rare, something she had not felt in years. She had just met a man who did not see her status, did not measure her value, did not try to gain anything from her. And for the first time in a very long time, that mattered more than anything money could buy. By the time Ethan turned onto Maple Street, the city noise had already faded into something softer, something familiar, the kind of quiet that did not ask anything from him, and he preferred it that way. His truck rolled to a stop in front of a modest one-story house with peeling white paint and a front porch that leaned just slightly to the left, not broken, just tired, like everything else he owned. And before the engine fully died, the front door swung open. Dad, you are late. A small voice called out, light but certain, and a little girl ran down the steps barefoot, her ponytail bouncing with every step, her smile wide enough to make the whole street feel warmer. Ethan stepped out, his expression softening in a way the world never saw. 5 minutes is not late, he said, crouching down as she reached him. It is called fashionably delayed. She laughed, not fully understanding but enjoying the sound of it anyway, and wrapped her arms around his neck like it was the most natural thing in the world. Did you bring the sketchbook? She asked quickly, pulling back just enough to look at him, and Ethan tapped the passenger seat with a small nod. Always, he replied, and her eyes lit up like he had just handed her something priceless. Inside the house, the air smelled faintly of detergent and something sweet, maybe the leftover pancakes from that morning, and sunlight filtered through thin curtains, casting soft lines across the worn wooden floor. Ethan set his keys down in a chipped ceramic bowl by the door while his daughter climbed onto the couch, already flipping through the sketchbook, her world simple, her joy immediate, untouched by the weight he carried quietly every day. Look, she said, holding up a drawing of a small house with a crooked chimney and 2 stick figures holding hands. That is us. Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that stayed in his eyes longer than his lips. You forgot the truck, he said gently, and she gasped, grabbing a crayon to fix the mistake as if it mattered more than anything. The room settled into a calm rhythm, the ticking of an old wall clock, the distant hum of a passing car, the quiet scratch of crayon against paper. And for a moment, everything felt steady, held together not by money or luck, but by something quieter, something stronger. Ethan leaned back against the kitchen counter, watching her, his arms crossed loosely, his thoughts drifting not to what he did not have, but to what he refused to lose. And somewhere, in a part of the city filled with glass buildings and polished floors, a woman stood by a window, her reflection staring back at her with a question she could not ignore. She held the same paper cup, now empty, but not forgotten, and her fingers traced the edge slowly, thoughtfully, as if trying to understand why a small moment refused to leave her. Who was he? She murmured under her breath, not expecting an answer, but knowing it mattered. Because in a world where everything had a price, everything had a purpose, everything came with expectation, she had just encountered something that did not, and it unsettled her more than anything else. And far away, in a quiet house on Maple Street, Ethan Brooks rinsed a coffee mug at the sink, unaware that the simplest thing he had done that morning had already begun to move through a world much larger than his own, quietly, patiently, like something waiting for the right moment to return. The next morning came quietly, the kind of quiet that settled into the walls before the sun fully rose, and Ethan was already awake, standing in the kitchen with a chipped mug in his hand, staring out the window as pale light stretched across Maple Street. The world had not changed, not for him, not overnight, and that was exactly how he preferred it. "Dad, do we have cereal?" his daughter called from the hallway, her voice still soft with sleep, and he turned slightly, grounding himself back into the rhythm he trusted. "Top shelf," he answered, "and do not pretend you cannot reach it." A pause, then a small laugh, the kind that filled the space without needing anything in return. Breakfast was simple. 2 bowls, one slightly chipped, one carefully handled, milk poured a little too fast, a few drops catching the edge of the table, and Ethan wiped it with his sleeve without thinking, not out of carelessness, but habit. "Are you working late today?" she asked, swinging her feet under the chair, and he shook his head. "No, I will be back before dinner." And that promise, small as it was, carried more weight than anything else he owned. Outside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint smell of asphalt warming under the early sun, and Ethan drove the same route he always did, past the same gas station, the same worn billboard, the same row of shops that had not changed in years, and for him, consistency was not boring. It was survival, across the city, far from Maple Street. The morning moved differently, faster, sharper, more deliberate, and inside a high-rise building of glass and steel, Olivia Hayes stood. In front of a long table lined with executives, her posture straight, her expression composed, the quiet authority in her presence enough to command attention without a single raised voice. "We move forward with the acquisition," one man said confidently, sliding a folder across the table. "It is the logical step." Another nodded, agreement echoing in a room built on decisions measured in millions. But Olivia did not reach for the folder, not yet. Instead, she looked past them, through the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city stretched endlessly, and for a brief moment, the reflection staring back at her was not the one they knew. "What about the people behind it?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting through the room with precision, and a few exchanged glances, unsure, unprepared for the shift. "It is business," someone replied, almost too quickly, and that was when something inside her resisted. Something quiet but firm, like a memory refusing to be ignored, the image of a man in worn boots, placing exact change on a counter without hesitation, without expectation, surfaced in her mind, uninvited but undeniable. Back at the shop, Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, the scent of oil and metal thick in the air as the hum of tools filled the space, steady, predictable, and a customer stood nearby, frustrated, voice slightly raised. It should not cost that much, and Ethan listened, not reacting, not escalating, just present. "It is what it takes to fix it right," he said simply, and there was no argument in his tone, only truth, the kind that did not bend to pressure. The man sighed, the tension easing just enough, and the moment passed like most of them did, without recognition, without applause, but across the city, in a room where decisions shaped lives. Olivia finally reached for the folder, then paused, her fingers resting on the edge, and instead of opening it, she closed it again, gently, deliberately. "We will review it again," she said, and the room fell into a brief, unexpected silence, not because of the decision itself, but because something had shifted, something no one could quite name. And in that quiet, far from the noise of Maple Street, the smallest act of kindness from the day before began to ripple outward, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet force that no one in that room was prepared to measure. The afternoon stretched long and slow, the kind of day where time did not rush but settled into the cracks of routine, and Ethan worked through it without complaint, his hands steady, his focus quiet, the rhythm of tightening bolts and checking lines grounding him in a world that made sense. "You always this calm?" a younger coworker asked, watching him from across the bay, wiping sweat from his forehead, clearly impatient with a job that refused to move faster, and Ethan did not look upright. Away, finishing what he was doing before answering. "It gets done either way," he said, simple, measured, like the answer did not need decoration. The coworker shook his head with a half smile, not fully understanding, but sensing something in it, something that did not rush to prove itself. Across town, Olivia sat alone in her office, the city stretching beneath her like a map she had memorized years ago, and yet today, it felt unfamiliar, like something had shifted just out of reach. Her assistant stood by the door, tablet in hand, waiting. "Your next meeting starts in 10 minutes, she said gently. But Olivia did not move, her fingers resting lightly against the glass, her reflection faint but present. "Cancel it," Olivia said, not turning around, and the assistant hesitated for just a second, surprised but trained enough not to question. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, already adjusting the schedule. Silence followed, not empty, but intentional, and Olivia exhaled slowly, as if giving herself permission to step outside a life that rarely paused. She reached for her phone, scrolling through contacts she rarely used personally, then stopped, her thumb hovering, and instead of calling anyone she knew, she set it down. Back at the shop, the day was winding down, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, and Ethan closed the hood of a truck with a soft, final click. "You heading out?" his coworker called, already grabbing his keys. And Ethan nodded. "Yeah, got someone waiting on me." And there was no need to say more than that. The drive home was the same as always, but the light was different, softer, golden, stretching across the windshield in a way that made everything feel briefly suspended, like the day had not fully decided to end. When he pulled into the driveway, his daughter was already outside, sitting on the porch steps with her sketchbook open, her legs tucked under her, completely absorbed in her own world. "You are early," she said without looking up, a small smile already forming, and Ethan leaned against the doorframe for a moment, watching her, letting the stillness settle in. "I told you I would be," he replied, and she nodded like that was enough, like his word was something she never doubted. Somewhere else, in a part of the city where decisions rarely waited, Olivia stepped out of her building without an entourage, without announcement, her heels quieter against the pavement than they had ever been. And she walked, not with purpose, but with curiosity, letting the city exist around her instead of controlling it. People passed by without recognizing her, without adjusting their behavior, and for the first time in a long time, she did not correct it. She turned down a street she had never walked before, past storefronts that did not carry her name, past lives that moved without her influence, and then she stopped, not abruptly, but with a quiet certainty. Across the street, a small auto shop, worn sign, open bay, nothing remarkable, nothing designed to impress, and yet something about it held her attention, something familiar she could not ignore. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the noise of the street fading just slightly, and without fully deciding to, she stepped off the curb, crossing toward a place she had no reason to enter, except one she could not explain, because sometimes the smallest moments do not end when they should. They wait, they return, and when they do, they ask a question that changes everything. The bell above the shop door did not ring loudly, just a soft chime that barely cut through the low hum of tools and the steady rhythm of work. But Ethan heard it anyway. He always did, and he glanced up briefly, expecting another customer, another routine conversation about costs and timelines. But instead, he paused. She stood there, just inside the doorway, framed by the late afternoon light, no longer surrounded by polished floors or quiet assistants, just a woman in a simple coat, her presence calm but unmistakable. "You found me," Ethan said, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging what was in front of him, and she gave a small smile, one that did not try to control the room the way she usually did. "I was not sure I would," she admitted, stepping further in, her eyes taking in the space, the worn tools, the oil-stained floor, the quiet honesty of a place that did not pretend to be anything else. "This is where you work," she said, more to understand than to confirm, and Ethan nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Most days," he replied, his tone steady, grounded, as if the place spoke for itself. A few seconds passed, not awkward, not forced, just real, and then she stepped closer, stopping just enough distance away to keep the moment respectful. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, her voice softer now, stripped of the sharp edges that boardrooms required, and Ethan shook his head lightly. You already did, he answered. You said thank you. And that should have been enough. In his world, it always was. But she did not move. Not yet, because this was not about the coffee anymore, and they both knew it. That is not what I mean, she said, her eyes meeting his directly. Not searching this time, but certain, and for the first time, Ethan held her gaze just a little longer, recognizing that this moment was different, not louder, but deeper. Outside, a car passed, the sound fading quickly, and inside, the shop seemed to settle into a quieter space, like it was waiting. Then what do you mean? He asked, not challenging. Just open. And she took a slow breath, the kind that carried weight without pressure. I mean, people do not usually act without expecting something in return, she said. And I needed to understand why you did. And there it was, not gratitude, not curiosity alone, but something closer to respect. Ethan leaned back slightly against the workbench, considering her words, not rushing to answer, because in his world, answers did not need to be fast to be true, because it was the right thing to do. He said finally, simple, unpolished, and the kind of answer that did not try to impress anyone. She studied him again, but this time differently, not looking for status, not measuring value, but recognizing something she could not buy, something she had not seen in a long time. And if I told you I could change your life, she said carefully, watching for any shift, any reaction, any sign of interest, and Ethan did not move, did not lean in, did not ask how. He simply looked at her, calm, steady, grounded in something that did not depend on her answer. A quiet beat passed, and then he spoke, not louder, not firmer, just clearer. My life is not broken, he said, and the words landed gently, but they stayed heavier than anything else in the room. And for a moment, something rare happened, something neither of them expected. The power in the room did not belong to the one who could offer more. It belonged to the one who needed less. And in that quiet shift, everything changed without either of them raising their voice. The air in the shop held still for a moment after his words, not tense, not uncomfortable, just honest, and Olivia did not look away. Most people would say yes, she said quietly, her voice no longer carrying the authority of a boardroom, but something more grounded, more human, and Ethan gave a small nod, not dismissive, just acknowledging the truth in what she said. Most people have a reason to, he replied, turning slightly as he set the rag down on the workbench, his movements unhurried, deliberate, like he had nowhere else he needed to be. And you do not? She asked, watching him carefully, not testing him, but trying to understand a rhythm that did not match her world. And Ethan paused, considering the question, not because it was difficult, but because it deserved an answer that was real. I do, he said finally, glancing toward the open bay where the late afternoon light stretched across the floor. Just not the kind you think. And the simplicity of it settled between them, quiet but firm. Outside, the sound of a passing truck rumbled briefly, then faded, and inside, the space seemed smaller, more focused, as if the world had narrowed to just this conversation. What kind? She asked, softer now, and Ethan leaned back slightly, crossing his arms loosely, not defensive, just steady. The kind that does not change depending on who is watching, he said, and there it was again. That same quiet clarity that did not need approval. Olivia exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting for just a second, not away from him, but inward, as if something in his words had reached a place she had kept closed for a long time. Do you know who I am? She asked then, not with pride, not as a test, but as a simple question, and Ethan shook his head without hesitation. No, he said, and then, after a brief pause, added, and it did not matter yesterday, so it does not matter now. And that was the moment something shifted again, deeper this time, not just in the room, but in her. A few seconds passed, the kind that stretched just enough to let truth settle, and then she nodded, almost to herself, as if confirming something she had not fully believed until now. It should matter, she said quietly, but there was no conviction in it, only habit, and Ethan gave a faint, almost amused breath. Maybe in your world, he replied, but not in mine. and the contrast between those two worlds did not clash. It revealed itself, clear and undeniable. From the far end of the shop, a coworker called out, "Ethan, you got a minute?" And Ethan glanced over, then back at Olivia, the moment breaking just slightly but not losing its weight. "Give me a second," he answered, then turned his attention back to her, present again, fully. "Look," she said, stepping just a little closer, not to close distance, but to be heard without raising her voice. "I am not offering you something because I think you need saving." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I am offering it because people like you are rare." And there it was, not an offer of power, but of recognition. Ethan held her gaze, not surprised, not moved in the way she might have expected, but understanding, and after a brief silence, he nodded once, slow and certain. "Then keep it rare," he said, and the words landed softly. But they carried something that could not be argued with. Another pause followed, longer this time, and for the first time since she walked in, Olivia did not have a response ready. Not because she lacked the words, but because she did not need them. And in that quiet, surrounded by tools and worn concrete, something became clear in a way no boardroom had ever shown her. Respect was not something you could buy. It was something you recognized when you finally stood in front of it. And for a moment, neither of them moved, not because they were unsure, but because the moment itself had already said everything that needed to be heard. The moment did not break loudly. It simply shifted, like a door closing softly behind something that had already passed, and Ethan stepped away toward the far end of the shop, answering his coworker without urgency, without looking back, because to him, the conversation had already found its natural end. Olivia remained where she was for a second longer, her eyes following him, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of something steadier, something closer to understanding. "You good?" the coworker asked Ethan, glancing briefly toward her, then back, and Ethan gave a short nod. "Yeah," he said, picking up a wrench, returning to the rhythm of work as if nothing unusual had happened. And that was the part that stayed with her, not what he said, but what he did not change. Outside, the late afternoon had begun to soften into evening, the light stretching longer, quieter, and through the open bay, the sound of engines approached, low at first, then clearer, then undeniable. One black SUV turned onto the street, then another, then a third, moving in perfect sequence, slowing as they neared the shop, their presence out of place against the worn pavement and faded signage. Inside, the hum of tools continued for a few seconds longer, until one by one, heads turned, conversations paused, and even the smallest sounds seemed to fall away, replaced by a silence that did not need to be announced. Ethan noticed it too. Not immediately, but when the air changed, when the rhythm he knew so well missed a beat, and he looked up. The vehicles came to a stop just outside, engines idling softly, doors opening in quiet precision, and two men stepped out first, dressed in dark suits that did not belong in places like this, scanning the area without making it obvious, followed by a third who opened the rear door. Olivia did not move right away. She stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if this reveal was not meant to impress, but simply to exist. "Ma'am," one of the men said quietly, stepping just close enough to be heard, and that single word, spoken with respect, with certainty, landed in the space like something heavier than sound. The shop fell completely still now, tools resting midair, conversations unfinished, eyes shifting between her and the vehicles outside, trying to connect a moment that did not seem to belong together. Ethan straightened slowly, not reacting with surprise, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just standing where he was, grounded in the same quiet presence he had held all along. Olivia finally turned toward him again, the smallest movement, but it carried everything that had not been said, and for a second, the world outside the shop disappeared, leaving only that space between them. "Now you know," she said, not with pride, not with expectation, just with truth, and the words did not demand a reaction. They offered clarity. A few seconds passed, long enough for everyone else in the room to wait, to anticipate something, anything, a change, a shift, a response that would match what they believed this moment required. But Ethan did not rush, he did not fill the silence. He simply looked at her, the same way he had before, steady, unshaken, as if nothing about her status altered what he had already decided about her as a person. And then, quietly, almost gently, he nodded once, acknowledging the truth without letting it redefine the moment. And in that silence, something far greater than wealth or power revealed itself. Because the room did not go quiet because of who she was, it went quiet because of who he remained. No one spoke, not right away, not after the last word had settled into the air, because sometimes silence is not confusion, it is recognition, and the people in that shop were not waiting for noise. They were trying to understand what they had just witnessed. One of the men in suits shifted slightly, as if expecting direction, but Olivia did not move toward the cars. She did not gesture. She did not reclaim the space with authority. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was, her attention still on Ethan, because the moment was not about power, it was about truth. "You could have asked for anything," she said finally, her voice calm, but carrying further now in the quiet room, and a few heads turned toward Ethan again, curious, measuring him in a new way, as if trying to see what she had seen all along. Ethan glanced briefly at the others, then back at her, not uncomfortable, not elevated, just present. "I did not need to," he answered, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than anything else that had been said. A faint breath moved through the room, not quite a reaction, more like a release, and Olivia nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already decided but needed to hear out loud. "That is exactly why I came back," she said, and there was no performance in her tone, no transaction hidden behind her words, just respect, clear and unguarded. Outside, the engines of the SUVs idled softly, patient, waiting, but inside, time seemed to stretch just a little longer, giving the moment space to finish what it had started. Ethan looked past her for a second, toward the open bay, the fading light, the ordinary world he understood, and then back again, and there was no hesitation in him, no conflict, just clarity. "Take care of your people," he said, not as advice, not as instruction, but as something closer to a principle, and Olivia held his gaze, receiving it not as a challenge, but as something she intended to keep. "I will," she replied, and for the first time, it sounded less like a promise to the world and more like a promise to herself. A small pause followed, and then Ethan gave a slight nod, the kind that closed a conversation without ending its meaning, and he turned back toward his workbench, picking up the same wrench, returning to the same task, because his life did not need to change to prove anything. The room watched him for a second longer, waiting for something dramatic, something worthy of the moment they believed they had just seen, but nothing came, no grand gesture, no sudden shift, just a man continuing exactly as he was. Olivia stepped back then, not retreating, but accepting, and she turned toward the open bay, the light catching the edge of her expression in a way that softened it, not weakening it, just revealing something quieter beneath. As she walked toward the waiting vehicles, the men fell into place without a word, doors opening, engines ready, but before she stepped in, she paused, just once, glancing back over her shoulder, not to call out, not to interrupt, just to see, and Ethan was already working again, focused, steady, unchanged. The door closed gently, the convoy pulled away, and the sound faded into the distance, leaving the shop exactly as it had been, except it was not really, because what remained was not the memory of who she was, but the truth of who he had been in that moment. And as the tools resumed their rhythm, and voices slowly returned, there was a quiet understanding that settled into the space. Something no one said out loud, but everyone felt, that dignity does not announce itself. It does not ask to be seen, but when it stands in a room, even the world, for a moment, learns how to be still.